Hello everyone, my name's Justin Byrne. I'm one of the senior ecologists here at AiDASH working on the BNGAI product. And we very regularly handle CAD files and post-development plans for sites for BNG that have been worked on by a variety of people, including landscape architects. And this talk is really aimed at both landscape architects who are looking to streamline their process of producing a BNG plan, and also ecologists who work with those people who want to try and work more effectively with them. It's going to have a few different parts. We're going to introduce the topic, and then we're going to talk about designing, making landscape design plans for BNG, or that best support BNG. Then we're going to talk again, as I said, about how ecologists working with designers can think about that process. And finally, there's a bit of a hodgepodge at the end of some different habitats that we have some difficulty with sometimes in post-development plans, where we can think about how we would incorporate them into our planning, and also how we think about designing spaces that are going to maximise the condition that those habitats can reach so that we can get the best out of them in terms of BNG. And that is something where I think both ecologists and designers need to spend more time thinking about those rules of thumb for how we create plans. So, as I said, if you have any Q&A questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and at the end I'll get a chance to go through them. But this is from CAD compliant, creating the best CAD plans for conversion to BNG. So, we all know that BNG has become a legal requirement since February 2024 for many developments. Not all developments, but with the planning and infrastructure bill coming in, this is likely to change. So at the moment, it's simple to say for many developments. And we all know that landscape architects or designers on projects are going to be producing either CAD files or we've seen drawings on the back of envelopes, we've seen PDFs, obviously, all kinds of things that form part of that plan for a site, and those vary in complexity, especially given the size of the project and the kind of site you're working on. At some point, the ecologist or someone working on that project will need to convert the designs for that site into a BNG habitat plan that can be fed into the metric and that we can get our reporting out of to demonstrate compliance. Normally, the ecologists working on this, I'm going to say ecologists as a shorthand, but it could be anyone. Normally, this is a geospatial approach, often in GIS, and the precision of locations and the accurate measurement is a really important feature of that. And we have found that often this iterative process of design can be slowed down by difficulties integrating the landscape designs into the BNG plans or vice versa. And so maybe we can align better across this process to make us more efficient and save time and prevent these headaches. And so this is our contribution to this conversation. For ecologists working in this area, especially, it's really important to know that landscape designs and BNG plans serve very different needs. So if you're a landscape architect or a landscape designer working on a design for a site, you're really thinking about the multifunctionality of that design to meet many different purposes. That design might need to indicate the site's compliance with either regulations or with best practice in the design field, and that might include adding in certain features or certain aspects of the design that are not focused on BNG, because BNG is not the only part of this design process. A design might be a co-design process where the local community is having their input too, and that can add complexity to this. And the design document is a visual document. It's often meant to advertise things. You take the same designs and put them on all kinds of stuff to show locals about what you're planning to do on the site. And so this can be a bit more conceptual sometimes than literal and prescriptive, and that's one of the things that we'll be taking away from today, is that we need to think about where we need to be following the design process perfectly, and we need to have that communication, especially with the landscape architect, about what they think this design is supposed to mean. BNG plans, on the other side, are very precisely defined to fit regulation. We need to fit them into the metric, so they need to be defined in terms of what those habitats are called, in terms of the areas, the description, the use of different symbology, the use of different feature types. And what we're prioritizing is the BNG information. We don't want to have a BNG compliant plan that includes things like the insides of buildings designs. That's too much detail for BNG. And in some sites like the small sites, whether the polygon limit or a feature limit, it may be difficult to incorporate all the different details that might be on a landscape design into that plan. So we're going to reduce a lot of the detail, especially in urban landscapes, and that again will be a theme of this talk. In BNG, the design is explicitly spatial or tabulated. We want exact spatial dimensions. We want numbers of trees. We want other details like that that are specifically defined. And this is supposed to be literal measurement as much as possible, and geospatial, focused on spatial accuracy. And these two approaches, as you can see, have different value, different needs, things like that. We found it's especially difficult to meet these multiple needs on small sites, as you've probably experienced. It's very difficult to get that 10% gain. We have to balance all other kinds of constraints like access or whatever. And when you have a single home development where it's just garden and home, then you have very few options in terms of how you can enhance the site or how you can create biodiversity. And finally, in this instruction is what we're experiencing some challenges with, especially if you're new to this process, is the iterative nature of design. So when we are designing things, when we go through landscape design and CAD production, that is an iterative process. It goes through many loops of this cycle before we get something that might be sent to an ecologist to work on for BNG. We're going to try and overlay that landscape design onto a baseline map that we've produced of the site by doing site visits and surveying. And using that, we're going to have to work out what's been lost, what's going to be enhanced, what's going to be created on site. And that process involves a lot of cleanup because normally the geometry that's been created in part of the landscape design is not very easy to work with in GIS. So that cleanup can take a long time, and part of what we're talking about is trying to minimize that cleanup. And if we can't do that, that might get sent back into this iterative design process again so that we can get something that we can work with. When we get through that, we're going to be checking the BNG impact on site. We're going to get a rough idea of whether we meet that 10% gain and whether the training rules are satisfied. And if they're not, we might well be going back to the start all over again. And finally, when we have managed to do that, we'll be filling out the reports, the relevant metrics, and there might even be things then that cause us to go back to that design process. And this process of many iterations here and more processes here that can send us back to the start again is what's causing a lot of slowdown. So if we are designers and we're looking to support BNG better, what can we think about? Broadly, when we're working with especially CAD files, we want to be producing something that is a ground level map, unless we're working on green roofs or green walls that will fit into the metric. But broadly, even then, we probably want to have that all on one level. We don't want multiple maps around the place that can be confusing for digitizing and can make things unclear, especially when the language in the document and the CAD is not clear. At AiDASH and lots of other environmental consultancies now, we're trying to move towards a more automated process for converting CAD files to GIS files, and that automated process can be quite dumb. So extra detail can make that very confusing and can require manual intervention. So I don't think anyone's at the stage where they're fully automatedly working on all CAD file types. But it's worth knowing that that's the direction things are moving in, and if we can try to create something that can be seamlessly converted, that's great. We want to work in model space, which is an area where you can specify lengths and distances and spaces, and even a projection. So the CRS, this georeferenced in British National Grid, we can do that in model space, but not in layout space. So please try to work in model space for creating those accurate drawings. And generally, we want to create a plan that has 100% of the red line boundary covered in something. And there's no gaps in that. Even very, very, very small gaps can create big issues. Or overlapping polygons where we have to the ecologist has to decide what was the intention of this design. And we don't want to be doing that really. We want to make it really clear what the intention was. So one habitat in every spot in the land. Ideally, this is in its own individual layer for that habitat type. So one layer is all the modified grassland on site, one layer is all the other neutral grassland on site, one layer is all the built surfaces on site, that kind of thing. And we might have additional metadata that provides context for this site. Within BNG, there is very clear definitions of how things should be mapped. So most habitats are mapped as polygons, and there's a polygon feature type in CAD design normally that should be used. So we would like to avoid mapping habitats in unclosed lines whenever possible, because that can be a real headache to digitize, or not digitize, but to translate into a GIS document. So if you can try to use the polygon feature for creating area habitats, that's anything that covers the ground basically, or indeed covers roofs. And then there are two types of linear features in BNG. There's hedgerows and watercourses. So what we mean by linear feature here is the hedgerow, especially we're talking about. The width of that hedgerow is going to change. So in BNG, as you cut it. So in BNG, we just care about the length of that hedgerow, the line, and the habitat that's underneath is supposed to be the habitat that's adjacent to that hedgerow. So ideally place the hedgerows down as linear features, as lines only with no width, and then the habitat that goes underneath that area that the hedgerow occupies is the adjacent habitat. So hedgerows mapped as lines is a real big help because that helps us calculate areas much easier. And if you don't do that, then the ecologist will have to do all kinds of manipulations to create those areas under hedges as the adjacent habitats. And that can get really messy as well. And it will often, because the way it works is you have to extend both things on either side of the midline of the hedge underneath. That can actually increase the amount of sealed surfaces on site, reducing your BNG score if it's done in certain ways. So ideally, you would want to do that yourself to try and maximize that. Watercourses are also mapped as lines, but really polygons are absolutely fine, as long as they cover the general watercourse footprint. But you can include a centre line if you want, because that's the part that's relevant for BNG. That centre line is how it'll be measured. But polygons are fine. And trees will be mapped as points. And in BNG, that's how they're represented. Their canopy size doesn't matter because all the trees that we're planting are going to be assumed to be small in size, according to the BNG metric. So try to create those points. But it's also fine if you want to use a symbol for that, as long as it has a clear center point, so we can kind of go, okay, that's where the tree is supposed to be. And that's really important for working out condition score and things like that. Ideally, all of these things will be in their own layers, and those layers will be named with the BNG habitat name that exists in the DEFRA metric. So it'd be great to download that metric, work out what all those habitat names are, especially for the urban habitats, and try to fit everything into those for a BNG plan. I know that's a lot big ask, but that will be really helpful for speeding things up. We have our own data standard that we use for our ingestion of post-development plans into our systems, but there are other good just general practice guidances produced by companies like Ecospatial or InTouch Geospatial Services that go through similar things like this about why there's challenges in converting CAD files and what those CAD files should look like for BNG. Some details in BNG probably get lost, like when we're trying to convert to BNG, and that's fine, that's helpful, that's good. So you don't need to include things like utility layouts or contour lines or text in that file that's going to be translated per se. Like those kinds of things tend to get stripped out when they get converted to the geospatial format, to GIS. So I probably would try to preserve that information in a different way. If there's a really important piece of text, it's probably going to get lost in translation. So either have it as a layer name or perhaps have it as a piece of metadata or a supplementary file. We don't need like internal building designs or roof schematics or detailed garden plans. And these kinds of things, I think, can be really confusing for junior ecologists, and many ecologists working on BNG are quite junior, when they're trying to work out what the design should look like. So we'll talk a lot about gardens later, actually, but we just want to have we want to go with fairly simple processes. BNG is very robust, having a very simple approach to how we're mapping for the post-development. What we do need is accurate locations as much as possible. I've yet to see a good DWG that is properly georeferenced, and that's not a fault of a landscape architect. That's just because the format that you're working in CAD is not designed really for that kind of work unless you're really geared towards that way of thinking. But locations is really, really valuable. And if you can have management or biodiversity areas that you know about, you have an area where you're planning to do a more biodiverse, more green kind of conservation area. If that can be defined really clearly, that's great. Equally important is what kind of management you're thinking of doing, because that can help an ecologist work out what condition they think they should go for, and what species mix you're going to be planting there, because again, that will help with understanding what we're going to go for here. We want habitats in the right feature type, as we've said, so polygons, lines, or points, that's really needed. And if you're not georeferencing the site, we would really be beneficial to have good georeferencing information nearby. Obviously, plans are not always drawn to scale, so that can be challenging. But I've regularly georeferenced CAD designs using the external building layout outside the red line boundary to kind of work out where exactly this thing is supposed to lie. And that's not an unusual process. So if you do have good measurements and you have good information about what that is, that can be useful for understanding where you have drawn the red line boundary and where you think the boundary of the sites are, because frequently there are differences between red line boundaries that people submit and things like, say, the Ordnance Survey assessment of where that land is. Yeah, and if you know anything about the intended habitat condition, that's really valuable to know about. So if someone's told you that this is going to be a grassland in this condition or a woodland in that condition, that's great to put in the layer name too. And if you can separate, if you like, amazing would be separating out different habitats as different polygons, even if they're adjacent, if they expected to have different condition, because all of that's like brilliant, super helpful, make things super quick. So yes, now if you're an ecologist on the other side of this process, I think that it's important to, yeah, as I said, recognise that landscape architects are designing for multiple purposes, and this is a collaborative creation process that you are supposed to be getting involved with as early as possible. If that is possible, I know that's not always possible. I know there's not always good communication that enables you to do that, but that's how landscape architects tend to work, and they want you to do that. I think I would guess, I would hope. And in doing this, as we said, CAD often is a scaled drawing, but often we're working with things that aren't really drawn to scale, or they're designed with other things in mind, which means we don't need to take everything we're seeing as literally what we need to convert to our BNG plan. So try to get involved with that landscape architect as early as possible so that you can work out which of those things we're dealing with. Are we dealing with a plan that is supposed to be very accurate, or are they happy for you to make modifications to this in some areas so that we can get closer to a higher BNG value? And the metric has loads of tools for supporting this. This is just one example, but if we know we haven't got a very detailed plan, make use of the urban broad habitat type that's described in the metric so that we can just get rough ideas about what the BNG value of that land is going to be, especially if that is very speculative at this stage, and we might change where buildings are or how big they are. If you can get an idea of how big the relationship between the gardens and the houses is going to be, beyond, that's great. It's better to use that code, obviously, or that habitat type when you're road plan, but like if the road plan's going to change, but broadly the same amount of roads are there, that's also great too. So there's loads of things like that in the metric that we can use to change how things are mapped to be more robust or just more like fit for how BNG is intended to be working. It's really important to guide the landscape architect to the key constraints and opportunities on site. So those constraints are things like irreplaceable habitats, wet or floodable areas, and obviously high distinctiveness or higher condition habitats. The landscape architect should be doing these kinds of things already, but definitely check that. Make sure you're helping with that. And those high distinctiveness, high condition habitats, those are things that they're not going to have a great idea about, and can have a really often plans will work. Not in that way, but if you adapt where things are positioned on site, you can get the same plan into the same site, but just in different places because of the different condition values. We want to identify some of the opportunities. So we want to point out lower distinctive habitats that either can be enhanced or might be developed on with a minimal BNG impact. So that's really valuable. And the landscape architect is looking to create a sense of place. So if you think there's something on site that's really got potential to be enhanced into a high biodiversity feature, that might be something that they want to incorporate as like a focal point of the design. So if you engage early, you might be able to lead that design process in a very fulfilling way for both of you. It's also again worth considering if what is mapped is corresponding to a real feature in the BNG metric. So some examples of this are things like hedges. Hedges, are defined in a specific way in terms of UKHab and the hedgerow handbook. Broadly, hedgerows, depending on how you look at them, should be at least 20 meters long. But ignoring that, gaps in hedges only count as gaps if they are. They don't count as gaps if they say access points. So if very common for a landscape design to do a hedge and put a gap in it for a gate. That doesn't need to happen in BNG. You can let that hedge go right through more BNG units, whatever. So that's how it's designed to work in the metric. So there are loads of things like this, like habitat mosaics. Like a heathland only needs to have 25% cover of dwarf shrub. You might be able to mix other parts of the design into a larger, say, heathland habitat, because the heathland habitat is not just the bits that are heathland. It includes the areas of, say, lowland, dryas, grassland, or whatever you've got. So really knowing the how the BNG metric is designed and the space within it that you have can be very useful. And I've got an example of that later with playgrounds. And that means that you might see what the landscape architect's done and go, no, we can do this, but we don't need to map every detail of this. Part of that can be a part of a larger habitat, or the habitat can be larger because it includes these areas as part of its condition or whatever. Be aware that there, of multiple needs with the landscape architect. They might be trying to create open space. They might need to have, alternative space for people to use for, say, dog walking or whatever. That takes pressure off natural spaces. They might need to put suds in. They might need to put parking in, play areas, visual and sound screening in the form of woodland or lines of trees. Slope and aspect will all impact what the engineers can do, and obviously access. And that's not just access to the site in terms of vehicles, but also access from the residents or workers who are on that site to the land that they own or the land that surrounds where they live. And it's important to keep that in mind when we're planning for condition, and also when we're thinking about how we're going to monitor this site and manage this site, because there really can be tensions between reducing the disturbance on natural areas that we need for condition and letting residents use the land they live in. I think that we're definitely seeing that when we're fencing off areas of land for condition, we're then seeing residents feel resentful about that. And ideally, we want something which is going to we're creating somewhere nice to live, and that's not just for nature, that's for people. England and Britain, UK generally, are massively human altered landscapes, and part of our natural heritage is the fact that these spaces are modified landscapes and have human influence, and that's not really something that we are going to be completely changing with BNG. But we've started to kind of form some knee-jerk responses as an industry to what is possible with BNG. What can we do? There must be some default answers, and I think that is true. It's very useful to have those heuristics, but let's not be afraid to challenge some of those. Let's focus on that mitigation hierarchy, which is slipping in some areas, trying to retain things, because retaining is often the most easy way of preventing or of reducing the amount of BNG units we need to create. So identifying those things and retaining those things, really seeing if we can adapt designs to retain features, and then let's try not to take positive options off the table. I've seen lots of trends where people are trying to adjust redline boundaries to avoid working with rivers or ancient woodland, and sometimes that is what we need to do to get a site to be compliant. But generally, don't just think that. To work it out. So see if it may well be that really simple changes in, say, a woodland can get a great improvement in condition, and so it's very viable to include that woodland. And maybe even create units, to potentially even sell off-site. The other thing is, watercourses have a lot of potential, as we'll talk about a bit later, for improvement. It's not always very expensive to improve a watercourse. Sometimes it's really simple things, and so definitely think about including those where you can. Sometimes, like you might putting something on a site works in one location but not in other locations, and we've really often seen things like ponds, which I've written about recently, being taken out of designs because they don't actually achieve biodiversity in that area because what was existed on that site in that area was previously a medium deciduous habitat or a more valuable habitat. But if you put that pond somewhere else, it would achieve positive change in that location. So that's important to think about. Really, really, really encouraging reshaping of the plan to try and get that to work. So we need to be thinking creatively. And I've given some examples here, but we've kind of talked about already. Like, if you're working in a floodplain, or ideally you're not building houses in a floodplain, but if you're working on developing land that has floodplain, if you're thinking about putting in a habitat, you can say, okay, putting in these individual habitats, but actually sometimes there's a mosaic habitat that meets the same habitat description, and I think this is really important when we think about wood pasture, where we know that the description of wood pasture includes football pitches, modified, like amenity grassland, even farmland, as long as the key features of that wood pasture are still there. I'm not saying to create terrible stuff, but I'm saying, if you're working in these areas, you might be able to retain, say, wood pasture in an area when you're changing that's on that habitat cover. Maybe the condition reduces, but because these mosaics are quite flexible in how they work, you might be just fine. So it's worth exploring those things. Remember that the metric has this flexibility within it. We don't always just want to be creating other neutral grassland. There are lots of other viable ways of working, especially when we remember again that habitat descriptions are quite broad. And they are, that there's space in those places to put in bits of other features. And there'll be lots and lots of times where we need to think about, we need to go beyond BNG and think about creating a sense of place, creating a sense of space, and working with that. So, yeah, that's the thing. And the final thing, I suppose, was, it's important to remember that the trading rules only apply up to no net loss. What I mean by that is, you know, what we don't need to get that 10% improvement in every part of the site. If we have, say, an ancient woodland on site, if there's no net loss, then yes, you do need to get units that represent a 10% uplift with that area included. But it doesn't have to be woodland units. It doesn't have to be the same type of woodland as the other thing. So bear in mind that in that 10% zone, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you achieve that uplift, and we should be thinking about that. Right, I'm just check my time because I don't actually have it up here, and I will do a thing. Yeah, so I told you I'd have a kind of a few examples of things, and so yeah, working within landscape architect requirements. Landscape architects often need to put SUDs in, play areas, and SANGs. That's like a really common thing to see on designs. And what can be frustrating often is that those designs don't include any information about what those things will look like in terms of their BNG value. It's just that they will be there. So I'm just going to check that thing. So we can get involved quite early in that process and work out what the cover is going to be, and we can say, is it going to be an unsealed surface? Is it going to be a sealed surface? Are we going to work with? Sorry about this. Are we going to work with all that stuff? But we can also think more creatively about creating natural surfaces on those places to maximise the BNG value. So, for example, for SUDs, we know that in a completely water covered areas are going to be part of that SUD system, certainly, but in a retention basin, those slopes of that retention basin are going to be some kind of natural habitat, and that will have a higher BNG value than the alternative. How we feed that SUDS feature, our gut is to go for bioswales, and I think that's normally a good idea, but we can also go for ditches, because if we've lost watercourse units on site, then it might be valuable to use ditches to feed the watercourse, and then we can get our watercourse units back and things like that. So we can be creative in terms of how we fulfill these things. We don't need to necessarily just go, it's a SUDS, we put SUDS there. Equally with SANGs or play areas, we can also be creative in terms of going, what ground cover we've got there. So these will be, if you're not familiar with this, things that are mapped on CAD designs as leaps, neeps, or laps, those are play areas, and sands are these suitable alternative natural green space, I think that's what it's called. And these are all things that, I'm just trying to work out what time I've got left, that have to be there, but what the ground cover is and how that fits into the natural landscape is still up for debate. So can we change the ground cover? Can we add deadwood perhaps into that play area that makes it a more exciting place to be, and then creates that variation that we need for condition score, and may also help us create other condition score improvements for other areas? And could that play area be incorporated into a different habitat type? So, for example, woodland, as we know, only needs to be 25% canopy cover in an area. So a gap in a woodland, that could be filled with a play area, and that play area would be creating the open space that is needed within that woodland to create good condition. If the ground cover type is suitable, and maybe we have bits of deadwood as we said, we could be getting a woodland that has a very good condition that just happens to have a play area in it. Now, these things aren't possible on every site. They're not going to fit the design needs of every site, but it just shows that we can be creative in terms of how we fit these things together, and that doesn't always need to be to the detriment of the environment, especially if it encourages greater alignment and cohesion between people and place and nature. So the last thing I say on this, in terms of ecologists working with landscape architects, is that we want to planning for the fact that we're going to be going back and forth very often with landscape architects, and sorry, I'm sorry, very distracted because I'm just trying to work out how much time I got left. Anastasia could message me on Teams, that would be great. If we engage early with landscape architects, we put in the budget, our time budget, like what we're that we're going to have this back and forth. If we budget for that work effectively, and think that we're going to need to be helping the landscape architect understand a few different things that will include is it a lot of what the landscape architect will do is think about the practicalities, and that will include are the plants that we want for the site sourceable? And is there enough stock to do this design? So think about that. And in terms of managing the site beyond, we often think about monitoring in terms of the biological impacts, but we should also think about creating educational material that we can use to inform residents or workers on that site of what needs to be done to get to that maximum condition, because often that is just as valuable as changing the management methods. Okay, I'm going to whiz through some general tips for specific habitat types, and then we'll have time for questions. Okay, so for both ecologists and landscape architects, there's some general things that we can have as rules of thumb for designing without any particular habitat in mind, but things that are just generally good principles to getting the best condition out of the site. So we already probably know that it's more difficult to have high value habitats very close to developments, because the impacts of residents in terms of, say, damage or dog walking or nutrient inputs or car driving, all of those things can hinder the creation of high value habitats. But we can use like nudges to help create low impact areas within the site. And sometimes these are very strong nudges like fences, but simple things like, where in the site is easiest to get to, where's most accessible, is there a slope that means people are going to be congregating in one area of the site than another? Is there a way we can encourage them by drawing them in with landscape design to a certain area? Those things can all help change the relative impacts of compaction and nutrient input on a site. So let's think about that. Generally, we want to be planting native if we can. It's nearly all the condition criteria. Well, not nearly all, but in very many condition criteria for very many habitats, native species presence is really important. And what's also very important is the absence of invasive species. And so we really want to understand, I'm sure this is done already, but we really want to understand as landscape architects what invasive species are, which species are invasive, and which one of those might be things that we might accidentally include into our sites. And we want to have things like, effective biocontrol when we're doing the building on site, to make construction on site, to make sure those aren't introduced. And this can be very important, especially when working with wetland systems and pond creation, but it's important everywhere, really. One of the things that, again, lots of different habitats have, grasslands, urban habitats, is this idea of varied structure. And varied structure really just means that we have like plants of different heights. We have plants that flower in different time periods. We have varied composition. We have flowering and non-flowering. We have different kinds of microclimates within that space, different areas where different kinds of species can thrive. In grasslands, this means creating grasslands with different height. In woodlands, it can mean creating woodlands with different sized trees and different canopy sizes. And in urban spaces, it just means creating those structures that that ununiformity, that variability within that urban space. Um, and generally, trees are great. Like we like trees. They can be really valuable for getting additional area habitat units on site, um, as long as they're not trees in gardens, which count for nothing if they're created. So yeah, specifically for urban habitats, we want to aim to create that varied, structure. Like we want different height vegetation. We don't want to plant invasive species if we can avoid it. I have seen it done. We want to, or potentially done. We want to use plants that create year-round color. That's really important for creating like varied nectar sources, but also just differences, variability within what we're planting, and obviously try to include native species. And I think see if you can find areas where you can allow untidiness to exist that residents will tolerate, because that untidiness often will allow more natural species and weeds to dominate, which are also really important, especially if we're working on ex-brownfield sites. Gardens are really tricky in BNG, and many people have experienced this. I've got lots to say about this that I'm sure many people will disagree with, but in post development, certainly the level of detail that's needed for gardens is very, very low. So gardens are defined as two types in the metric, and I'm talking here about gardens for private dwelling houses, which is what gardens apply to. They are either predominantly vegetated or they are not predominantly vegetated. No more detail is needed than that in the post development plan. And if you add additional detail to that, like splitting out the vegetated and unvegetated parts of the design garden, you're going to reduce the BNG value of that site, of that area, and that may not be necessary given the size of the garden and that context. The original definition in UKHab's old definition, which again they've taken this out, but they included lots of different things in gardens that were allowed, as part of that garden definition, including polytunnels and decking and things like that. So if there's a small amount of decking, a small amount of paving on site, a small amount of maybe a tiny water feature or something like that, especially in the post development, all of that can be simplified into is the whole footprint of that garden predominantly vegetated or not predominantly vegetated. And I would say, I think in many cases it's even suitable to combine the front and rear gardens into a single feature and say, is that predominantly vegetated or predominantly unvegetated? That is all the detail that you need for the application. And if you divide that area up, you'll just be reducing the BNG value of that garden because you'll be increasing the amount of, say, unvegetated areas. Unless you're saying that there's a really small patch of vegetated that you can add in that helps the overall calculation. But yeah, so in that garden area, we don't want to include any new plant habitats. That's explicitly mentioned in the metric. And obviously, new trees, being small trees, do not count for any BNG units in gardens. So try not to include any trees or new habitats in your designs, because that can confuse, especially more junior ecologists, and can lead them to overinflating the value of BNG of that site. And then you might get quite far down the process before you realise you have to take them out, and that can cause all kinds of problems. So try to avoid including them in the CAD. We only care about gardens in dwelling houses, which is a defined term which you can look up. But in larger shared accommodation, where say there's a building with 10 units in it, or a care home, or something like that, those don't have gardens. They have the other defined habitats. But the garden habitat types will not exist in those areas because the garden habitats are only for those private residences. Um, but yeah, we do want to map within that any external built structures, like any external buildings or detached garages. We do want to include those as their own features in there. We don't want to merge all of that into the garden. Okay, When it comes to trees, again, I've written about this as well, but there's lots of things we can do to improve the condition score of trees at the design stage. Obviously, planting native species that are ideally UK sourced will improve the score by reducing the disease risk, pest risk, and improving that native species score. But we also want to think about placing these things with two things in mind, especially. One is that we want to make sure there's a buffer of natural vegetation around that tree that is about at least 20% of the mature canopy size. So if we think how big this tree is going to get, at least 20% of that area should be underneath should be natural vegetation to maximise the score. And this can be difficult if we're placing trees next to paths or next to especially junctions of paths or surrounded by built surfaces. So try to do that. And avoid planting really close to a building such that you're later going to have to cut off a limb of that tree in order to prevent it from impacting traffic or impacting a building. That's a real force. If you're doing that, that's a fault, and you really, you know, that was a mistake that you've made on your own design. We don't want to be doing that. That's a specific condition criteria we're trying to avoid. So plan for the size of the full mature tree. Another tip that you can have is by working with blocks of trees rather than individual trees, we only need to meet this condition criteria for the whole block. So that 20% is much easier to get if you're specifying that this is supposed to be a block of trees. So you can specify an area, say there's going to be 20 trees here, it's going to be a block of trees, and then that will be helpful to go, okay, what's the actual condition we can achieve in this space? For hedges, again, the same kinds of things. Native British source trees are really useful, but the metric is going to be asking that those hedges are 1.5 metres tall and 1.5 metres wide. And you'll know whether that's achievable in your current design. Lots of gardens, especially front gardens, are not going to have space for a 1.5 metre width hedge, and that's going to impact your condition score that's possible. The base of these things should be half a metre from the ground, so design that into what you're doing. There shouldn't be very many gaps in that hedge, so try to avoid desire paths that are that is going to be allowed as a gap in the hedge, whereas an unplanned gap in the hedge will be detrimental to its condition. So think about access, include that in the design, but then make clear that the whole hedge runs through that feature to maximise your units. Finally, the final thing which I want to quickly get to is watercourses. People get really scared about watercourses, I think, but actually it can be very cheap to improve them. These are some of the kinds of things that you're going to get in if you want to go and improving them. Obviously, you're going to be involving a hydrologist at that point. You're going to involve a lot more people that will help with that design process, but be aware that these are the kinds of things that you might be doing. So some of them are going to be leaving that natural buffer around the watercourse. And bear in mind that parkland, so amenity grassland, anything that's like heavily used, any footpaths, will not count going in, which is actually very low risk. We don't have any drownings from in rivers at all. It's not a thing that we should be worrying about over much, but it is going to be negatively impacting the condition score of that river. If you're adding a hedge to the side of it that's preventing natural processes of animals and say material getting into the river, then that will count as an encroachment. So don't plant a hedge on the side of very close to the side of that, blocking in the river. Don't put big fences that are going to block it, especially chicken wire fences that are going to block material and animals getting into the river. That's all bad. We're probably going to try to be avoiding reinforcing watercourses. The trend will be to creating more natural meandering watercourses with natural reinforcements where they're needed. And some of that stuff is going to involve creating flow variation as well in the river. And some of the easiest way of doing this is felling trees to lie in the river in a kind of natural way that will create different water flows in the water. So be prepared for that to be a thing you can do. It's also very cheap. You fell a tree and leave it there. It's not very expensive. And you might even be creating these leaky dams that also help with flood prevention, and that can be, I think, a good marketable thing to do. If we are doing these natural remeanderings, or we're removing culverts in river and creating open river, bear in mind that because that's one of the features that's described in Rule 4, where you get a lot more freedom in terms of how you implement your BNG, that doing that might allow you to do things that you couldn't normally do in a BNG plan, and that can create really interesting design opportunities. So you will need to be prepared for it, but these are the kinds of things that you might be exploring if you're working in design space with watercourses, and don't be afraid of it. So our conclusions are, try to create a CAD that has 100% cover with no overlaps, layer each name with a BNG habitat type, use polylines and lines and points appropriately, include the detail you need, but don't overcomplicate it, because especially junior ecologists might find it difficult to know what to digitize. And ecologists think more creatively about how you are implementing these designs. What do you need to take literally and what do you need to take figuratively? And let's try to start building these general principles about how we incorporate that into design. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I would like to suggest that you to also take a look at the Partner Ecology Programme, which BNGAI runs. And in this, we are helping ecologists locate BNG work they can do at their own pace, take as much work as they want, focus on doing the field work, and then use our system to help manage a lot of the things like GIS and preparing site maps and recording and managing information. And doing the admin. And also that comes with a lot of knowledge in terms of our expert training and knowledge base as part of that. So if you're interested in doing any of that, please follow this QR code or this link. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any questions. I haven't, let's just see if I've got anything. Q&A, here we are, right. Yes, so small sites seem especially tough to achieve 10% on. One of the practical strategies we see work in terms of balancing gardens, access and biodiversity. This is one I agree is really challenging. I think that it's very easy to get caught down all kinds of blind alleys doing this, where you think you've got something that works and the LPA rejects it. I think the best thing to do would be to engage with the LPA and see if they have I know, which again can be difficult, but if they have a practical suggestion of what they think they would accept as a way forward on this site. I think that yeah, it is very difficult. Generally, if we can create more public space and put trees in them, often just one tree is enough to get the BNG that we need. And also, I think that there's times where pushing back on the LPA and going, it's not reasonable to do. There's not enough impact on this site to warrant BNG is important. But yes, often we are going off-site to do that work. But again, if you can retain natural features on the site, then you can enhance those features as part of the. I think you can enhance those features as part of the post development, and that's allowed to get your BNG. So sometimes retention is the way forward. Right. One thing to avoid in CAD is blocks, e.g. special data features in the CAD to make duplication of objects or converting. These are summarised by insertion points. I completely agree. I regularly work with our teams who struggle with handling blocks in CADs, and that's what I'm trying to say with using the polygon tools available in CAD, rather than creating blocks or unclosed lines, which are really difficult can be really challenging to translate to a GIS format. So yeah, these are summarised the insertion points. I'm not sure if there's a question involved in that, but I do agree with that point that blocks are a massive headache when translating from CAD to GIS. So, and they don't need to be used, I think, for any purpose really in that CAD process, because there are other features like polygons that can be used. When it comes to trees and hedges, what's the detail that really makes a difference to condition scoring, and what's just overkill? The trees and hedges, again, native UK sourced is going to get you the best, and then the other thing is about placement for trees. Let's place trees that are going to meet those conditions around open natural space underneath, and are not going to have to be cut back harshly in the future to prevent them from knocking into buildings or buses. That's something where we can just make those decisions when we're planting the tree, in most cases, that will mean that we're going to get to that better condition, and really is achievable to get moderate or good condition in lots of cases. We can't really control damage. That's one thing that I think is going to be hard. So, kids are going to carve their names into things. You're going to you might get cars hit things, things like that. That's much more difficult to control, but you can do it to a degree with placement if you're placing things with some protection. I have written about this more, especially when it comes to planting trees in hedges, but that's another thing. In terms of hedges, I think you need to be realistic about going, what's your design idea for this site? Have you actually considered a hedge to be a 1.5 meter wide feature? And have you thought about the natural space around that? It's definitely worth looking at the condition criteria for hedges and going, do I think about these things at all when I'm thinking about what my hedges will look like on my site? And can I start planning and designing my hedges more often to incorporate these things as a landscape architect? For BNG, I think that you're limited by what the design works with to a large degree. Okay, when mapping watercourses for BNG, is it more important to show the footprint polygon accurately or to include the centre lines? Extra features like downs and corners. So I'd say the main thing, the most important things for watercourses for BNG is that where the bank is, which is neither the watercourse footprint or the polyline, because that's going to determine whether you're 10 meters within 10 meters of that watercourse if it's offsite, and also whether a riparian zone starts. So understanding what that bank means, and that's got a specific definition in the RCA. It's not a fluvial like hydrological bank. You know, in terms of, I don't even know what that means. I'm not a freshwater ecologist, but I am RCA trained, and the bank is a kind of, you know, it's really where the bank starts to flatten off, and they say often where you would put a shed. You know, the first point on the bank where you put a shed, and that can be quite high up and far away from where the water actually flows. So understanding that is really important to understanding if a river is off-site and how much land will be in that riparian zone that you need to be very careful about using. Then in terms of the centre line and getting that, and the watercourse footprint, getting those down, I think that's less important to a degree, because they will be fairly straightforward to get sorted. You know, in that riparian zone, you'll also have area habitats like woodland or grassland or whatever, and that means, and sometimes there's rivers that change in their size. The watercourse footprint should only really be the areas that are always covered by water or normally covered by water, and you can often get away with putting intertidal habitats low in the reach, or grassland habitats if it's a river that's often dry, or whatever the habitat cover is, in that area where the watercourse footprint sometimes covers but doesn't always cover. And that's why BNG cares about the polyline, because the actual width of the river does vary quite a lot in lots of rivers. So, and it may meander as well. So the length of that river is important, certainly, but yeah. Okay, I'm going to call that there. Thank you very much for everyone for your questions and answers. So yeah, please consider looking at this partner program where we will help you, direct you to BNG work in your area, and you'll get access to our knowledge base and other expert training. And thank you very much for following the webinar. It's available on YouTube if you want to get this and our previous webinars. You can go there to find out more.